Hello, friends. My name is Iris Josephina. I'm your host, and you are listening to the Planting Seeds podcast. On the Planting Seeds podcast, we explore how we can cultivate a more gentle relationship with our cyclical bodies, the earth, each other, and the world around us through using our senses, science, the subtle, and the secret. On Planting Seeds, we talk about all those topics you've always wanted to talk about. We are shamelessly opening up the conversations that we all so desperately need to settle in our precious bodies and relate to each other in a more open, truthful, and empowered way. I'm so glad you're here today. Welcome to a new episode of the Planting Seeds podcast. Today I have a guest with me whom I have been wanting to interview for a very long time, Nathan Riley. Nathan is an OBGYN and an end-of-life physician. He provides comprehensive women's health care in a truly holistic way, taking into account the mental, emotional, and spiritual aspects of health in addition to the physical. He's a father of two, the second of whom was born at home. He's married to his high school sweetheart, and he operates through a private association called Beloved Holistics, providing support to women and families who need support with fertility, pregnancy, postpartum, menopausal transition, and otherwise gynecologic care. He also offers himself as a collaborator to midwives and health coaches around the country in order to optimize their autonomy as practitioners. Welcome to the show, Nathan.
It is my pleasure to be here, Iris. Thank you.
So, when I heard about you being a holistic gynecologist, I got so excited because as a holistic health practitioner myself, this is what I truly wish for everyone to have access to. So when we are talking about holistic gynecology or a holistic OBGYN, what does that mean to you? And also, why do you think more people should be practicing that?
Well, I think it's a good question, Iris. When I was in the conventional model, which is what everybody thinks about when they think about a doctor, you go through all this school, you wear a white coat, you build insurance companies, you get paid a big salary, you do surgery, you do birth work, or you quote deliver babies, like you do all that stuff as an OBGYN. And the holistic piece really came to me, not so much that I'm against what the conventional model does, that they think that they do a fine job for what they're trained to do. We have a consumer base, like our clients that we're hoping to serve in healthcare, who, it's part of a culture, a society that wants to find an easy fix. It wants to pay the money and outsource the responsibility to other people, and those other people oftentimes are doctors, midwives, etc. And so the system itself is not what I have an issue with, which I've had to clarify now that I've become so outspoken about my sort of distaste for the system. I think more importantly, and more to answering your question, it's sort of like spanking your kids. A lot of people are like, don't spank your kids. And it's like, okay, why? Well, it's child abuse. Well, maybe it's not child abuse, but more importantly, it doesn't work. It doesn't make you, you can't submit your child because you're bigger than them into doing the thing that you ask them to do because you're going to threaten to hit them. So it's like, let's just not do that thing because it doesn't work. I feel the exact same way. It maybe seems like a strange metaphor, but I do feel the same way about the medical system. It simply doesn't work for a lot of people. I mean, for the vast majority of people, what the conventional medical model, specifically that in North America, which is what I know best, it doesn't really do it. It doesn't help you with your issue. It helps you find a very expensive Band-Aid for your problem. And as I started recognizing that even early in my training, med school was weird, residency was really weird. I did sort of heal myself and find, where I wanted to be when I was in fellowship for hospice and palliative medicine, which was the end of life piece that you mentioned in the bio. But I realized that, I am a pro with pharmaceuticals and surgery. And these things, like I said, are only working for maybe 5 to 10% of people long term. Take endometriosis, for example. You can have surgery or we can shut your endocrine system down, your ovarian axis down. That's great. Those things will stop the pain. But have we actually really elicited what's causing the pain? Or have we thought more about this not just being a physical issue? And that's where the holism comes into play. So I think to ask a person who uses the word holistic, I think that anybody out there who's seeking holistic care, you need to ask yourself, what does holistic care really mean? And I think most people would jump the gun and say, well, it means natural. Okay, so it is natural, but it's far more than just natural remedies, in contrast to surgery and pharmaceuticals. A holistic approach draws from holism, which as a philosophy is that the part of a system cannot exist independently of the system, and the system cannot exist independently of its parts. There is this delicate coordination of all of the parts. And naturally people then start to think about the body as a car. Like, you can't have an operational car if you don't have 2 axles or a carburetor or whatever else. But that's not really what this is about, because that still is stuck in the reductive Cartesian model and paradigm that we've been training and in many ways indoctrinating our healthcare workers with, in order to think of the body as a collection of organs, each of which can't exist without the body, and the body can't exist without each of them. But what I mean by holism in this philosophy is to take a step back and consider, yes, there's this physical person there in front of you. Yes, you have lab work. Yes, you have imaging. These are all pieces of information. But I would reckon that it's probably it's like 10% of the information that you really need to know. A holistic approach would require us to actually start to try to understand, who is this person? Where did they come from? What is their purpose? And where would they like to go? And that requires us to consider far more than just the physical. It forces us to look at the mental, the emotional, the spiritual components of the human experience. So when I started to kind of dabble in those domains, I realized that people were actually finding themselves again, and they were becoming whole, W-H-O-L-E, as opposed to whole necessarily. But they were becoming whole again. They were feeling better than they ever have felt. And I've had clients tell me, like, I haven't had this many good days in a row since I was 15. And a lot of it has just been getting to know them, hearing their story, talking about their past, this buzzword trauma. We all have traumas. How did that lock up into your body in some way at the age of 5 and now is manifesting 20 years later at age 25? I mean, this is real stuff, especially in the sacred rite of passage that is birth. So that is what holistic OBGYN in my approach, that's what that really looks like. We do far more talking and exploring. We do archetypal work. We use natural remedies, but those remedies are going to be very gentle. They're meant to nudge you onto the right path. And the term salutogenesis comes to mind, whereby, you are not broken. You don't have a disease process. Your body is manifesting a constellation of symptoms as a result of its inability to harmonize with your surroundings, whether that's in your home environment, your work environment, the cosmos, however you want to view that. So that's a long-winded answer, but that's what I do.
Thank you so much for elaborating that. And I'm also curious how that was for you personally when you came to this breaking point for yourself. Because once you see all of this and once you see what is lacking and what you wish so much for people to have in terms of care, if you work in healthcare system, I'm curious how that was for you when you saw it. Because once you saw it, once you see it, you cannot unsee it.
Yeah, it's like in the Wizard of Oz, like, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. It's like, okay, I guess there's still just this Wizard of Oz over there, but I can't really shake this image I have of this old dude pulling on some cranks behind a little curtain inside a little box. For me, it was really painful, actually. You can imagine investing 14 years of your life, including college. From the age of 18, essentially, you've dedicated yourself to this monumental task of becoming a doctor. And when I left the hospital system, at least the OBGYN practice that I was doing, it was really painful and I was mad. It was almost like a bait and switch. Like, this is not what I signed up to do, to be meeting quotas based on billing and documentation and based on some useless incentive. Like, hey, if we meet these quotas, we're going to get a pizza party. It was so juvenile to me. And when you do start to see other doctors and nurses as just other people who are trying to get through the day, and seeing how these strategies that we've been taught whether it's surgery, pharmaceuticals, or some other advanced life support technique, using these to overhaul the person, the human in front of you's, so what they're manifesting, what they've been embodying from either a life of perhaps poor resources, poor nutrition, poor whatever, and just like not seeing any results, but continuing to do this thing because we were taught to do it. It made me sad for like everybody. And it actually helped me develop a lot of compassion for my colleagues. Now, it didn't go both ways. When I told my colleagues in OBGYN that I wanted to go into hospice and palliative care work, they, like many people, say, oh, well, you're just giving up on people. Why would you want to do that? You're a surgeon. Like, don't you want to help people? You're not helping anybody if you're giving up on them. You know, it was that type of language. I received a lot of sort of threatening language, like I now have embraced it. I call myself the tattooed heretic of birth and death because I don't prescribe birth control pills. I mean, not like OBGYNs do anyways. I don't like doing surgery. I have a less than 5% C-section rate and have since I graduated residency because I'm like, yeah, thanks, but no thanks. We're going to do things this way over here. I mean, it's so confronting to the medical establishment that people within the medical establishment would turn their back and say, thanks, but no thanks. I mean, I've got $475,000 in debt, and I had to make a decision to cut myself off from the benefits and the big salary because it just wasn't in alignment with who I am and what I do. And mostly because of what my clients, I call pregnant women clients because you're not sick and you don't have an upcoming medical procedure. You're about to go through a transformational experience, which is birth. You are a client and I'm here to serve you. And even speaking like that, what I just said is enough for people to come at me from every angle. And I have to hold compassion for them because the reason that they're so upset with this type of stuff is because they know it to be true themselves. They know that the way that we're attending births, the way that we're recommending iatrogenic menopause for endometriosis, they know these things aren't great, but they've never been incentivized to look outside of the box. And again, like we have to maintain the truth that the medical system is not something that was nefariously created in order to strip you of your health and your money. It is a direct reflection of our society itself, which is a society in which taking responsibility, in which there's a lot of power when you take responsibility. You have all of the power when the decisions that you make, good or bad, come back to you. There's power there. None of us have been incentivized to ever exercise our power or to really take personal responsibility. And for somebody like me who's like, I'm going to have to stand up and take responsibility, that is confronting to people who have been afraid to do that themselves. So I hold them with the deepest respect that I can. But I will tell you, it is really painful still. Like, it's hard. It feels so alone to be speaking the way that I do and to be making friends with people who litigate against OBGYNs like Hermine Hayes Klein. OBGYNs that have made a woman feel like she was raped and that her partner, who was holding her other leg back, was complicit in this rape. I help Hermine review these cases, and it feels so bad to me because there's so much trauma in the world, especially amongst healthcare workers in maternity units. It's almost like they don't know any better, but they have to know better. We have to be able to do better. And I'm so sorry, doctor, but this is not acceptable anymore. So that's how it feels. It's a lot. It's a lot to do what I do. And it also, in my day-to-day life, I just listened to your episode with Jewel, is it McNeely? Beautiful episode. I have time to wake up and feel the sheets on my skin, to hold my little girls as close as I can, anytime that I want. If I want to make less money, I work less. If I want to make more money, I work more. And it's not a matter of carving out, like on a checklist, I need to spend time with my daughters. Like, I am with my daughters, and when I decide to work, I work. And that is another thing that probably really pisses people off. Doctors are not living that lifestyle. I have a great lifestyle as a physician. So,
thank you so much for sharing all of this. I can really very much relate to this. I don't think I told you this, but I used to work quite a lot as a doula, and I worked in hospitals as well. And I have seen obstetric violence happening right in front of my eyes.
Yeah.
And it's a lot. It's really a lot. And also the way this has been so normalized just keeps blowing my mind still. And how people can respond after birth, that they say like, oh, this all happened, but, I'm healthy. My baby is healthy.
Right.
And the fact that people don't really recognize the impact of this big transition that you spoke about, and then kind of like make it smaller and say, but, oh, this all happened.
Yeah.
It's, but we're healthy. Like me and my baby are healthy, and that is all that matters. And I'm totally on the same page with you when it comes to witnessing people who work in a medical establishment and then seeing people who undergo treatments in the medical establishment and how they try to protect themselves by making it right in their minds what happened to them. Like, I completely agree with you that, we have to hold so much compassion for both of these groups, like 100%. And, if I have to speak for myself personally, I have been so angry, like you spoke about anger. I have been so angry too, but I have also come to understand that I have to go beyond my own anger because it doesn't solve anything. The only thing I can do is like hold all people in so much compassion and love and respect. And then at the same time, taking responsibility for our job. We as people in this work, it's so important for us to stay centered and to take the responsibility and to serve our people who want to be served by us. So thank you so much for bringing that up. And I'm with you 100%.
Yeah, I'm not so sure what option we have right now, but to try to understand what one another is going through and like having conversations about these things, because I understand why doctors feel like they're out there trying to dispel misinformation or whatever. Like, I get it. Fine. Do your thing on TikTok or whatever, or Instagram. Like, you need to make an example of me or whatever, that I'm recommending against birth control pills, or that I think home birth is safe. Of course, like you mentioned, we had a home birth, that it was like heretical that an OBGYN would have a home birth. Like, what can go wrong. How could you? I mean, like, the nasty emails and the messages and the negative reviews on my podcast, as if like,
Because you guys had a home birth?
Yeah, you read it in my bio. Our second baby came at home. Yeah.
Which is very normal for me because I grew up in the Netherlands, where home birth is pretty normalized and it's pretty normal for people to give birth at home.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it was an easy decision. My wife had to kind of come around to it just because she was like, I don't know, I feel safer in the hospital. And that's fine. I mean, safety's a totally hard word to unpack in and of itself. But she was like, I don't know, I feel better having a hospital birth. And we did the first time. And the second time around, the COVID thing made it very unclear what was going to happen. Were we going to be getting swabbed while she was in labor and whatnot? So I think she was like, I think I'm ready to do the home birth. And we did. And it was probably the best day of my life, really.
Yeah.
So anyways, to speak like this and to not try to understand another person's point of view and to become immovable in what you think is true about the world. It's like the behavior of cancer. Like, you have disconnected yourself from the network of people that you rely on to stay alive in this world. You can't silo yourself off in a house in Kentucky with 4 very high walls and a pile of gold and make it through in life. Like, we have to be leaning into each other, but instead we are continuing to divide, continuing to lash out, pulling the crabs back into the bucket who are trying to climb out, just because we all want to suffer together. And it doesn't have to be that way. But when we do disconnect ourselves from other people and we silo ourselves off, intellectually or otherwise, that is going to take down the whole organism, that behavior alone, which is why I do compare it to a cancer. It's the behavior of cancer. And even saying that has gotten me reamed out. It's like, you're comparing people that don't agree with you with cancer. And I'm like, you guys have like, you're not stopping and really feeling into what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
We have to be connected. We are connected. And if you don't believe that we're connected, then you're defying the laws of ecology, where that tree outside needs all of the birds, the bees, the other pollinators, the flowers, the grass, the mycelial network, the mycorrhizae. It needs everything to stay alive. That tree is not that important, and it can't survive without its colleagues, its friends, its ecological companions. But here we are, post-COVID, sort of, And I feel like we're more divided than ever. It was a real opportunity, I thought, that COVID provided for us to actually become more thoughtful about our personal responsibility and how we show up in the world and how we communicate with our neighbors and friends and, other people overseas that we may never meet. But it just was further divisive. And I think that that's ever present in medicine. It is a brutal space for any healthcare practitioner. And I tried to hold as much compassion as I possibly can for anybody out there who's sitting and bearing witness to the experience of another human.
Thank you for sharing that. And what I also wanted to say is when I witness people in the medical establishment, what I was seeing and feeling is that many people who work in the medical system seem to be very unaware about where the practices that they perform and do every single day, there doesn't seem to be like an idea of where these practices are coming from. If we look at the origins of gynecology and how it is today, it has a very violent history.
Right.
And I feel that people who work in that environment don't really have an idea about where all of that comes from. It seems as if they really did not learn that in school. Because if we, for example, look at how midwives have been basically wiped off the table and white males have been taken over gynecology, what I'm feeling is that when people perhaps would know these origins and understand where it comes from and what the roots of modern gynecology are, that maybe not so many people would actually submit to practicing this at all. And if I think, for example, about my grandmother, bless her, I speak about this with her often. And when she shares about her birth experiences and how it was 2 generations ago, it was really community-based. It was the community helping when a woman was about to give birth. It was the village midwife who came for supporting the birth, and it was her cousin who came to do postpartum care and help her recover postpartum and helping around the house. I don't know how it was in your country, but in the Netherlands, where I'm from, this is how it was done, and it's really not so long ago. It's just yesterday if you look at it from a generational perspective. It's really not that long ago. And it was also very normal that people from younger generations were literally called in to come and witness what it's like to give birth and what it's like to be a newborn mother and basically see from very up close what it's like to go through this transition. And it was very normal that younger generations were made part of this. Like my grandmother was in her teens when she was called in to do postpartum work at another member of her extended family. Like when her cousin or an aunt gave birth, like she had to come in and be in her house for quite a period of time to help and witness and see how that life unfolded after birth.
Yeah. I'm guessing did you hear my solo cast that I did about the brief history of Western medicine?
No, I did not yet.
Yeah, so it's episode 72 on my podcast, which is called the Holistic OBGYN Podcast. I did about 4 months of research reading a bunch of texts that are probably familiar to people that are interested in the history of midwifery and obstetrics care, specifically through the lens of Europe and the United States. So it's certainly not comprehensive, but it was a 2.5-hour solo cast and it was titled A Brief-ish History of Western Medicine, Witches and Women Healers. And it is pretty much everything that should be taught day one of any training, but specifically OBGYN residency. There should be a day where we honor the history of how we got here and the incredible ups and downs of that process, mostly downs. I mean, I won't get too much into it now, but it is definitely a link to be shared with your audience because it does a great job of revealing 100 other doors that you could go down if you wanted to learn a lot more. But, to your point, I learned that history. And you can't unsee the man behind the curtain. And knowing what has been done to women as cosmologies changed and as power dynamics have shifted around the world, in women's power being in her sexuality, in her womb space, this ability to create life as a generative force of the cosmos itself. I mean, this was a power that men were so I think there was like a violent overthrow several times over history that is poorly documented because we're talking about like cave paintings. But imagine, as a big, strong man, I have nothing over this woman, especially when I see she can produce more people that look like me. I mean, that is very confronting for the men. And that's not to justify it in any way, but the only thing that they could do was to forcefully strip them of their power. And I think that what we see in medicine in our society is an extension of that. And men and women are both perpetrating this history. I mean, this is deep. This is a dark rabbit hole to go down, but there's been some horrific things done to women who care for women just because they were there for them, just because they had an amulet around their neck, just because they menstruate. I mean, it was the witch hunts of the 13th to the 17th centuries, or 14th to 17th centuries. It was a woman hunt and a child hunt. This was not a witch hunt. And it is a very, very sad story that we have yet to really fully appreciate, I think, in mainstream society.
Yeah. And also understand what it does to us today. I don't want to get too deep into it, but I believe we have that in our DNA. It's my ancestors.
Yeah.
Me, especially in Europe, like my ancestors went through this, and I believe it still sits in my body somehow. And I have to take responsibility to get that out, to understand it, to move through it.
Yeah.
So I don't pass it on to my children. I'm sure you understand how all of that looks and intertwines, but it runs deep.
Yeah. Do you know the writer Charles Eisenstein?
Yes.
So he's a friend of mine, and I had him on my show twice now, but on the second episode, he brought something up. I have to credit him for this because it was something I'd thought about, but he put such beautiful language to it. And he actually brought up the witch trials, and he was referring back to what we've been experiencing in the COVID moment and the sort of the hunting of people who were, spreading misinformation or whatever. I mean, it's been rough what we've all gone through these past couple of years, but he had said that if you look back to the witch hunts, how much trauma was done to women, right? And then he actually transitioned and he said, and how much trauma was done to the masculine as well. And what he clarified in that was that right now we need men to step up for women. We need male OBGYNs to step up for women. We need everybody to step up for women. We need women to step up for themselves. I mean, there's a lot of trauma to work through there. But one thing that people don't appreciate about the witch hunts was that if my wife was accused of being a witch, tried, which, by the way, the trial was between a priest or a judge, and then the second person there was going to be a physician. And specifically for a midwife who had amulets and charms and potions and whatnot, the doctor, who was a self-proclaimed professor of medicine, the doctor would then judge, was this good medicine or bad medicine? Was this witchcraft or was this actual medicine? With literally like a glance, just sort of like, sounds like witchcraft. And then they would burn her at the stake or torture her to death, even worse. So that my wife would be burned, tortured, mutilated in front of me and my family, my little girls. And I would have to stop and watch it happen for fear of my little girls being executed in front of me. So now, fast forward 400 years, give or take. I mean, it's not that long ago, right? It's really an impressively short period of time. So we're not that far away from this, removed. So nowadays, the toxic masculinity that we're seeing is actually, I think, a reflection of these deep wounds that men in our patriarchal lineage, let's say, have passed down to us after having been forced to stop and watch the love of their lives, their children just being torn apart in front of them and having to keep their mouths shut. So now what do? Now we want to put on football pads. We want to go out and show how big and bad we are. We want to show how tough we are. I'm not going to show any emotion. I'm going to go and get my revenge. I'm going to carry an AR-15. I'm going to show just how tough. Come and get me, mother effer, nobody likes that. I mean, not a lot of people like that. There's some people out there that get off on that. But if we're going to have any compassion for anybody, we need to simultaneously hold compassion for the men back then. Because now we're seeing the shadow of men having to restrain themselves against a scourge of murder that was sweeping across Europe and into the United States. So that's not me saying, hey, what about the men? I want to be very clear about that. What I am saying is that we have deep wounds across our society that we haven't even really, I think, been tempted to look into the mirror to really look at those wounds. And I think that we're seeing the results of not resolving some of these traumas on both the masculine and feminine over the course of history.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you. If I hear you say all of this, immediately what I'm thinking about is fertility. How does all of this relate to us being able and at ease in our own bodies and our bodies coming together and create a new human being? We both know that fertility is in a big crisis and nobody is talking about it. Could you share a little bit more about what your take is on fertility and specifically more the energetic parts of fertility related to all of this?
Yeah, totally. I think what people, and by the way, anybody listening out there who has struggled with fertility, there are very, very few people in the world who are truly infertile. So that is not me blaming and shaming. I want to be very clear. Being conscious of our language around fertility is extremely important.
Yes.
So just listen to this with a grain of salt. I'd say less than 1% to 2% of the entire US or world population is truly infertile. There are reasons. You may not have a uterus. You may not have ovaries. You may not have a patent vagina. There are anatomical things. There are a combination of other factors, from endocrine to immune to nervous system. There's all these things that can take place and prevent you from getting pregnant, even with IVF and everything else. So when we say our fertility rates are dropping, we have to be super clear with that language. Yes, they are dropping. Why are they dropping? It's probably for a combination of things that are not being addressed by your OBGYN. So physically speaking, we have anatomical reasons for fertility issues. We have physiologic reasons, and that covers the entire endocrine system. The anatomical reasons would cover, poor tubal patency. Mm-hmm. You've got anatomical issues with inside of the uterus itself. Some of those things I already mentioned. Like, that's the stuff that everybody knows about. You get the ultrasounds, you get the blood work, they look at these things. Oh, you're still not getting pregnant after a year of trying. Let's move to hormone treatment, But there's also mental factors. What does your internal dialogue look like? I'm infertile. I can't do this. I can't be a mom. There's no way that I can do this. I don't think I'm ready. Those mental patterns, that internal narrative, that is a really, really critical part of conscious conception. And we're going to talk about that because I know you did mention that before we started recording. There's also the emotional side of conception, which is how do you mitigate or how do you respond to stressors in your life? And stressors are not just my dad was in a car accident and I'm worried about him. That's one big one. But there could also just be deep down, are you worried about what's going to happen at your job? This past couple of years, people have been fearful that they're going to lose their job, their benefits, their pension, and everything else. If there's a low grade of stress in your life, how are you integrating that stress? Because poorly integrated stress is by definition going to show up in a trauma pathway. So going back to the witch hunts, how many incredible stressors were around in the 15th century, 16th centuries? We had widespread famine. We had cataclysmic, I don't want to say geopolitical, but let's say cataclysmic climatic events. We had geopolitical events. We had a feudalistic society in most of Europe whereby, we have to sort of see what we see today, where there's most of the power and money is held by, a top 0.1% of the population. So there's all these stressors, right? And add to that, now you don't know if you're going to live tomorrow because somebody may have just accused you casually of being a witch. If that stuff isn't resolved, it's still manifesting now. There is still some deep work to be done. And if you do any, reading and look into regression therapy and whatnot, there's quite a bit of some pretty profound, we'll call them case reports, because this is not going to ever be a giant population study. But people go into these regression therapy sessions and they can tap into 2, 3, 4, 10 generations along their lineage, and they can discover, oh, this birthmark is here because I was shot through the chest with an arrow, or I have a raspy voice because I was strangled at one point in my life, or perhaps when I was in utero I had a cord around my neck, or whatever. These stories abound. So there's this emotional body, and this is where you find your abilities to cope, and it's both conscious and unconscious. This is your feeling body, whereas your mental body was your thinking body. And then of course we have that spiritual body, which is where you would find a person's greater sense of purpose and connection to a higher power. So when I meet with clients, most people expect, they're like, do you want me to send you my blood work and all this? And I'm like, yeah, we'll get to that. But I want to know a little bit about you first. And they're always a little perplexed. What do you mean know about me? I want to get pregnant. And I'm like, yeah, let's talk about that stuff since it's important to you, but we're going to spend the vast majority of maybe our first 90 minutes getting to know each other, talking about not even the lifestyle change stuff. We're going to talk about your current archetype. Which archetype do you wish to embody? And which archetype are you presently embodying? And you could go to Jungian, archetypes, whatever. Doesn't really matter. It's really a matter of how you see yourself showing up in the world. What are 5 activities or things that nourish your body, soul, and spirit? Are you spending your time, the vast majority of your resources, doing those things? What could you add to your life to feel whole? What are you holding on to? These are vague questions, but sometimes people send me back a blank worksheet and have no responses. And it's because nobody's ever asked them about this. What is your love language? I have a couple other questions that are for my fertility clients. What does your partner need to feel prepared to have this baby? What do you need to feel prepared to have this baby? And what does your baby need to feel fully invited into your womb?
I love that you asked these questions.
That's some heavy, heavy stuff. So I'll pause there because I know I've said a lot, but this is the approach that I take to fertility. And all but one client have I managed to help assist with conception. And I'm a little bit concerned that maybe I have met my mark, that I just can't help this clientele, but we're still working on it.
Thank you for sharing that. And also for recognizing that fertility is so much more than just bringing an egg and a sperm together.
Yeah, right.
And, when people come to me, they have often gone through the entire system and they just do not feel seen. They feel like they are a number.
Yeah.
And then again, my heart breaks because I'm like, oh my goodness, you are not a number. You are so not a number. You're like a whole human being,
Yeah.
And on top of that, these people have this sacred desire, this wish to become a parent. They are like ready for this like sacred passage into parenthood. That's big. And, the system is just like, oh, okay, here's your ultrasound, here's your blood work. And wow.
Yeah.
And I'm like, how can you reduce a human being who has this gigantic desire to that?
Yeah.
And, every time it just does not compute in my brain, like how people can see other people like that or reduce other people like that. And then I'm often also like, who are all of these people who look at fertility in such a reductionist way?
Yeah.
And, this is not to say that I'm not grateful for all the knowledge and technology that we have these days that does help some people. But, still, it's a mystery to me that there are people who treat other people with such a beautiful, big desire in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And, at the very beginning of our conversation, we were talking a little bit about personal responsibility. And I think that whenever people hear that term, they take on a victim mentality, that because you're telling me that there's personal responsibility for this, you're shaming me and you're blaming me for this outcome. And that's not actually what this conversation is about. I'll reiterate what I said before. If we can recognize that there is something that you're able to do, let's not call it personal responsibility. Let's say there is something that is in your control, which is just another way of saying personal responsibility. Then you can embody the most powerful version of yourself. And you may not even recognize that person because of all the reasons we've already discussed. I do think that we also have to acknowledge that for people who might find the way that I'm talking about conception to be a little woo-woo and everything, like, I get it. Before I realized just how sick synthetic hormone disruptors were making women, which is another word for the hormones, I'm using air quotes on my end, that your fertility specialists or your OBGYNs are giving you for every reason under the sun, including fertility. Until I saw how unpleasant the adverse effects of that were, long-term and short-term for that matter, I would have been like, hell yeah, this is a great practice. Let's make sure that I know how to do this so I can get every single person on these synthetic hormones and make sure everybody gets pregnant. But the problem with that approach is that if your body is not conceiving naturally, there are other things that are in your control that we could work on so that you're not predisposing yourself to risk factors when you do get pregnant. So IVF is a great example. Women who have IVF, that is an independent risk factor for a host of pregnancy complications. including miscarriage, including fetal demise, etc. So that tells us that there is something wrong with the human organism. Not something wrong, but there's something that could be improved upon before we hijack it with these synthetic hormones and force it to become pregnant, despite perhaps the available resources for it to do so in the most healthy way possible. And so, again, this is not blaming and shaming. This is saying there are things that are in your control. And if you're trying to call in the spirit of this baby, you need to lay down the healthiest soil possible. That is the only way that this is going to be possible. So I think that when women go to their doctors, I think it's confronting to hear somebody talk about conscious conception, which is basically everything I just described. That is the conscious conception approach. And of course, we're already laying down the healthy soil. We're doing diet, lifestyle modification to the best of that person's means. And fortunately, a lot of the stuff that I do from a lifestyle standpoint is not expensive. In fact, most of it is free or very cheap. But when you go to your doctor was trained through the lens of the 16th century philosopher René Descartes. I used the word Cartesian before. What I was referring to is René Descartes' contributions to the body of science. And at the time, we were still using like cow dung and, petrified eyeballs of newts. And, it was like we were still kind of stuck in the old, it definitely was the Middle Ages. It was even the high Middle Ages, but we were still not that far in our understanding of the body. And partly because the church was not going to permit anybody to dissect into bodies. Until René Descartes came by, and he really had this, the essences of his work included the certainty and knowability of scientific truth. So mathematics was the key to understanding everything in the world. And so there was this developed process of analytical reasoning. Let's break this bigger thing down into smaller parts, and that's going to help us understand the greater organism. But this is getting us away from holism, as I described it before. René Descartes' work basically led to what we now, might see as the human body analogous to a machine, and the mind and body being separate. And if the soul, he didn't specifically talk about the soul, but the next iteration of this was, if the body is just a meat suit and the mind and the soul are separate, then we should feel comfortable cutting into the body because we're not going to disrupt the soul. So again, the church has had such a stronghold over mother culture for so many centuries that when you go to your doctor, we are still looking at the body in the way that René Descartes sort of, paved the path for hundreds of years ago. And so we can't be hypercritical of the medical system. But if the medical system isn't working, why not just start to unpack some other possibilities? Like if you've spent 50 grand on 3 rounds of IVF, why not try something else? What could you possibly lose by starting to work through some of the mental, emotional, and spiritual aspects?
Yes, I totally agree with you. And what you just said also makes me think about how people are actually educated about the body, about their body. And, people are not being taught that we can also look at the female body in a continuum instead of a vacuum.
Right.
We are connected through all these cycles that our bodies move through, and they massively impact one another.
Yeah.
Like how we treat our bodies throughout puberty, throughout our 20s, throughout our 30s, will impact how our bodies will respond in our late 30s, our 40s, how we transition to menopause even. All of this, I'm sure. But when I explain this to my clients, I literally see things clicking and falling into place for them. And it's so beautiful to see that happening. But, when I explain it to people in that way, people start to understand, everything I'm doing to my body or giving to my body actually impacts how my body is responding and talking to me. And then we can get to this personal responsibility part that you were talking about earlier. But then, it's also the educational part. Oh my God, Nathan, I work with so many highly educated people, university trained people, and so many of them have no idea, zero clue about their own body. As a doula, I was explaining basic biology and physiology of pregnancy to highly educated PhD people who just got pregnant. And so often I was just like amazed, surprised, like, man, what am I doing here?
Yeah, I mean, going back to the last episode that I listened to of your podcast, I listened to your episode with Hermine, who's a dear friend of mine, and she's just an angel sent from above. And then I listened to Jewel McNeely. I was listening to her episode, and there is so much wisdom in such a simple concept of slowing down. Like, there's so much you can learn. There's so much wisdom to tap into by slowing down and really slowing down, not having a checklist of things you have to do for your daughter or your wife and whoever else, but like just stopping and being is no longer an acceptable way to spend time. And a friend of mine, Nicole Jardim, she wrote a book called Fix Your Period.
I did a training with her. She's my mentor.
Oh, she's rad. Yeah, she's another friend of mine. She's amazing. She and I were talking, and we came up with a t-shirt concept. So nobody out there steal this. I'm going to do this. Pregnenolone over productivity. And pregnenolone, of course, is the mother hormone of your adrenals. But we're constantly... I'll send you one when we finally get them made.
I love that.
This idea that go being the only thing that's incentivized has made it completely unacceptable to just stop and slow down and look out the window and not have a podcast on at all times and not be doing 10 things. And I am the most productive person that anybody will ever meet. I am so capable of reading and listening and watching and building something all at the same time. It is like truly a gift. I might not be great at any of those things, but I'm like fairly good. And I finish the day and I have a hard time laying down and not going 100 miles a minute. That should not be something that seems boastful. But now when I say that, people might say like, wow, he's really stellar at what he does. He can get so much done. That shouldn't be something that we reward, especially when we know that we need to slow down and we have like an addiction to achievement or productivity, whatever you want to call it. There is so much you can learn about yourself by just stopping and slowing down. So much so that at least 50% of the women who come and their partners who come to me for assistance with their fertility journey, the only thing that they need is not to pay me money. What they need is to actually stop and tune in to what they need. That is so hard for us. It doesn't require you to go to a retreat or to book a vacation or to go and buy $1,000 worth of grass-fed beef. It requires you to just stop and like listen. And that is not very easy for us to do, but that is actually the cure for so much of what's happening in the world, especially in fertility.
I love that you're saying that and that you're putting it so simple because it's really true.
Yeah.
I've had clients who went through several rounds of IVF and, doctors were saying to them like, well, actually nothing is really wrong with you, like physiologically.
Yeah.
And anatomically, but then you can get pregnant. And then after a couple of months with me, seeing me regularly, literally sitting with them, doing nothing and showing by example, they got pregnant just like that.
Yeah.
Just like that.
I did fellowship training in hospice and palliative care. And when a person is dying, we have the other sacred rite of passage in life. When a person is not just dying, but facing mortality, because we're all technically dying, but most of us are not facing mortality. The only other time many people may have faced mortality, especially women, is when they gave birth, because there is a shedding of this old and birthing of a new. The maiden is dying, the mother is being born, literally. And that's why so many women feel like, I felt like I was going to die. You did die. There's nothing safe about that. That is probably the scariest thing you could possibly go through. So kudos to you. And at end of life, we don't have like an outcome that we can measure. We don't have any way of like measuring. Was that a good death? Did we do it right? Like, he seemed like he was comfortable. I don't know. We gave him enough morphine that he passed out completely on me. We tend to use these like grimacing of the face and this and that. But I will tell you that of all of the tools that I've learned, and this is actually how I started realizing, oh my gosh, if we could sit with birth the way we sit with death, we have found the answer to maternity care in the United States, and probably most of the world. Don't get me wrong. But when a person is being faced with, let's say, like, I don't know, like a cancer diagnosis, we immediately want to start offering tools, advice. We want to have a conversation around their advanced directives. We want to do all those things. But what that person needs right now is just for somebody to bear witness to what they just heard, which is, hey, I know you didn't think you were going to have to think about mortality for another 40 years, but we're going to do it right now. In fact, I'm going to land this big C word on you, and now you're going to be doing that. What is required of a person who's caring for another person when they're looking at mortality? It requires us to sit there and be present and patient with the process of acknowledging, oh my gosh, I didn't think I'd have to talk about this or think about this, and now I have to think about that. If you were to then replace that person who is diagnosed with cancer or whatever else with a person who's starting to feel Braxton Hicks contractions, of course, there's nothing to do. You're at the top of the roller coaster, you're about to go over the hill, and there's no going back. So the more medicine, the more advice, the more things we are saying and doing in that moment of birth, the further we are getting away from the really critical thing that you do, which is to just sit there and be. But since, like we just said, we don't practice being in our own bodies, let alone holding space for somebody else, it sounds like an impossible task, and that's why people don't do it. Yeah. It's way harder than prescribing medicine and doing surgery. Surgery and medicine are easy. It's easy. But being still and bearing the pain or witnessing the joy of a person without reacting, without responding with some answer, Mr. Fix-It, that is really hard work. And not many of us have to practice that.
It actually makes me emotional when you say that, because it reminds me of how I said to people after witnessing my first birth in India, how this experience and the energy in the room was so similar to the energy in the room when my father was dying, when I witnessed him, but the energy just went in the opposite direction. But the practice of bearing witness and seeing and having nothing to do but be there, it's the same thing. And there is so much wisdom in these profound experiences because they have to do with the certainties of life. Like, we're going to be born and we're going to die.
Yeah.
But these are the two aspects of life that we almost like push away and don't want to deal with. While these are actually the biggest moments in our lives that we can actually learn so much about and learn about ourselves and us as people and learn about what community means and what it means when someone is actually present with you in such a big moment. So thank you so much for saying that.
Yeah.
I'm really moved, by the fact that you mentioned that, because for me, this is the core of the work that I do, that you do, that we as people in this field get to deal with and get to do. And, Mike, it's such a privilege to be able to do this and to have the gift of being able to be a witness. Because you don't only learn about the process of birthing and dying, you also learn so much about yourself, where your own limitations are, where your own triggers are, where your own sensitivities or insensitivities are.
Yeah.
It's so big.
Yeah, if I may, there's a story that I love to share.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
It really illustrates this, because a lot of people might be pushing back and they're like, your job in birth is more than just sitting there and holding space, you dummy. They might be saying that about me. And that's okay. I've heard that so many times that it's sort of like, it should be a t-shirt of itself. It'll be our bonus gift if you order one of our Pregnant Alone Over productivity shirts. But what happens when you have birth and death in the same moment? When you're caring for somebody who's facing mortality from both sides of that coin. And of course, I'm talking about something tragic happening in childbirth. When I was a resident, I was a fourth-year resident, which is like our chief residency. I'm the commander-in-chief on the unit who's basically being observed from afar by the attending physicians, the sort of veteran docs that trained us to do this. And now that you're fourth year, you are better at most things even than them because you're doing it all day, every day. So I'm kind of the guy in charge. I go to attend to this woman who's going to have a baby at like 32 weeks. Her water's opened up and she's in full-blown labor. She's there with her husband and girls, 2 kids. And the baby comes out, and this woman was on magnesium sulfate because the babies that are born really early, I think she was like 30 weeks, actually. I think it was really early. So we know that some mag sulfate can actually reduce the risk. It's a little reduction, but you can reduce the risk of cerebral palsy if you give mag sulfate for these super premature babies. So the baby comes out, and the baby's a little sleepy because of the magnesium sulfate. And the magnesium sulfate also prohibits the uterus from contracting down, makes it really like kind of lazy. So she's like, the mom is losing a ton of blood. So I'm attending to her, and I'm kind of looking over my shoulder, and this baby's not crying. There's not much going on. It's not like magnesium sulfate. It was like, something's up. The baby's trying to move, but there's no crying or anything. So more and more people start flooding into the room, and they call in the respiratory therapy, paratherapist. They even call the neonatologist, who generally doesn't have to go to the births because they've got a whole team of people that do everything, and they're rounding on the babies in the NICU and whatnot. They call in those people, and they're like, we can't get an airway, and we're going to have to go to the operating room. So this poor woman is hemorrhaging, and she's under control. But they whisk this baby to the operating room. The dad goes with them. I think grandma or somebody takes the kids. And they take this baby to the operating room. They call up a couple pediatric surgeons, and they put this baby under sedation, of course, and they cut into the baby's throat. Like, you've seen it happen in movies where somebody uses a pen to produce like a tracheotomy. They cut in there, and they don't find a trachea. And they're like, what is going on here? Apparently, this baby had a 1 in a billion malformation, no trachea at all. So there's a mouth with a throat, but it's a blind pouch back there. I mean, there's an esophagus, but there's no opening to a trachea. There's lungs with airways, but there's no connection between the back of the throat, it's called the nasopharynx, or the oropharynx, and the main stem bronchi, which you see on like x-rays and stuff. So this is happening, and they're like, wow. Oh my God. So they start calling around. Does anybody in the hospital have any ideas? Like, pediatric surgeons come up, they're all scratching their heads. This baby's got one of those bags you see on ER movies, just with an artificial airway into the chest wall itself, like just getting some oxygen there. And she's alive, but this is not sustainable. So this is like 20 minutes after the birth. They're already we're all sort of looking at each other. I eventually make my way there. Mom is there now with dad, and this baby's on the table. We have to tell her that there's no trachea and we have no solution here. So, of course, this is probably one of the saddest things that this family has ever gone through or will ever go through in their life. I cannot possibly put myself there. And I have 2 little girls of my own, and every single time I tell this story, I start getting choked up, which I'm doing pretty good with right now. But the only option was, your baby's going to die. What do you want us to do for her? So this woman is saying, well, I want to hold her. So she's holding her little girl, wrapped up in a blanket. She has just given birth to this little baby. And now this baby is no longer being ventilated and is taking a couple really shallow breaths. And the hospital team is rearranging instruments. There's doors swinging back and forth. They're printing out labels for this specimen or that or whatever. They're clicking on the computer, documenting things. They're talking about who's going to go on, off shift, who's going to take their break now. I mean, it's just this cacophony of noise, which is what you experience in any labor and delivery unit. But at this moment, we have a baby that is dying. So somebody's I remember adjusting her blood pressure cuff or whatever, and she just, can I cuss on your show, Iris?
Sure. Yes.
I don't have to, but I think that there's no replacement for what this woman was experiencing. She said, can you all just leave us the fuck alone? And of course, it was as silent as it is now. You could hear a pin drop. And everybody in the room filed out. I think everybody realized what was happening here and what the lack of stuff there was to actually do. And it was me and a nurse, and we stayed with her as her baby took a couple breaths and then stopped moving and passed away.
Wow.
So I challenge anybody out there who works in maternity care, anywhere in the world, I challenge you to consider that despite your training having told you that your value to society is finding the answer to a problem, I want you to consider this scenario. There's no moral of the story, by the way. But consider this scenario and ask yourself, what am I able to do when there's nothing to do? and have the things that I've been taught to use, whether it's a scalpel, some other instrument, a drug, whatever, am I sort of by necessity finding ways to use those tools because I was trained to use those tools? And do I always have to have the answer to the test question? I think that we'll find that as we start to investigate how to improve maternity care, improve fertility treatments, etc., that there doesn't always have to be something that you're doing with the things you were trained to use. And instead, is there a way for us to harness some other deeper power that we haven't been very good at practicing? Nobody's really modeled it for us. Nobody's incentivized us to practice this muscle. But to just be with a person, whether they're happy, sad, in despair, completely destroyed, and bearing witness to what they're going through. Is that perhaps therapeutic in and of itself? And I would say that at end of life, it absolutely is. Why wouldn't it also be relevant in birth, which is the other side of the same coin?
It actually reminds me again of the passing of my father. At a certain point, there were two nurses who came in to tell my sister and I, or to ask my sister and I, whether we wouldn't have to sleep right now. While we were informed a couple of hours earlier that our father was passing, our father was dying. And I had to sit that woman down and tell her, like, you listen to me now. And I was 19 years old at the time. And I had to tell her, my father is dying. My father is transitioning to the other side. And I want to witness, I want to bear witness of every second of that. And you can't tell me what to do. And, the amount of time it took for her to let that sink in and really be able to understand, like, maybe I can just say nothing and be here as well. It's like I had to say it, just like the woman in your story had to say to leave her alone, to be quiet, to be silent.
Thank you for sharing that about your father. We only get one father, and many of us only have one father. And it is so hard to lose a parent. It is a real severing. It's an amputation of such an important part of our lives. And I really appreciate you sharing. I think that the term that was coming up for me as I was hearing you talk about your dad was reverence. And I'm not speaking through the lens of, Christo-Judaism, whatever. I'm talking about reverence for the sort of magic that's all around us. And if sitting and watching a person pass away, especially your own father, if there isn't some magic there to be explored, then I don't know what is. We just don't seem to appreciate or to be able to revere the sort of beauty and magic of the human experience any longer, which is, of course, a part, everything we've talked about up until now. But man, if we could just look at the world again with childlike eyes and have reverence for the beauty of, like, you woke up today and you got to hug this person you love so much, and you got to go downstairs and make coffee, and you're just taking your time with it, and then there's this little breeze that comes through. Like, what an incredible experience.
And, all of the things that we're talking about right now, your story, my story, in essence, to me, it's about respect.
That's right.
It's about respecting these big events of life. We don't have to micromanage them like so many of us try to do. We just have to learn how to respect them, deeply respect them, as if they are something sacred, because they are. It's also in these experiences, like I said before, that we learn so much about ourselves and who we are as people.
Do you feel like you learned about yourself through your father's passing?
Oof, yes. It was the biggest initiation of my life. Yeah. And also about my own intuition. There was a very specific moment where I intuitively felt what was going to happen. And my grandparents from both sides would also come. And they would arrive at 9 a.m. And it was 6 a.m. in the morning. And I felt myself almost like rising out of my own body and overseeing the situation. And I heard myself say to my mom, you have to call them right now because 9 a.m. is too late. And my mom didn't have to think for a second. She just did it.
Yeah.
She saw me, she felt me, and she did it. And at 9 a.m. sharp, he passed and all of us were present. So to me, there is so much intuitive potential when we get to have the privilege to witness the starting and ending of life.
Yeah.
And, I'm forever grateful, even though it's emotional and painful still that he's not here. But, that experience changed the entire course of my life.
Wow.
100%. And I'm extremely grateful for it. And I feel blessed by it, even though, it hurts like hell still. Yeah. We talked about so many things I had no idea we would be talking about. This has been such an incredible conversation, Nathan. Wow. Thank you so much.
It's very much my pleasure. Yeah, I'm kind of just pausing after your reflections on losing your father. It's really, I really appreciate you sharing. It's very much my pleasure to be here, Iris. I'm glad that we're connected and so grateful to be able to share some of this, just talk through some of these things because it's really helpful for me as well.
Yeah, and I really hope that people who are listening to this feel humbled and inspired and nourished and have their hearts opened up by all the topics that we touched upon today, because it's been so much. And I also feel like I want to say to all the people who are listening, who made it to the end, take a moment to be with yourself right now, to sit with your own self, sit with your body, and see what is happening there now. How did this conversation move you, shift things within you? And I also want to invite you to share that with us, send us a message, send us an email about how this episode touched you, moved you, gave you insights. We are very happy to hear what it brought you, because we talked about so many things that have the ability to move you in a million different ways. And I know we touched upon very big topics. So I also want to leave the door open for all of you to share what's going on within you. Do you have something to add to that, Nathan?
Well, you oftentimes start your shows with, a question related to what's one thing that we can all start with. I can't remember how you frame it, but I was actually pondering that question before we started recording, and it was I guess my paraphrasing and sort of recollection of the question was sort of what is something that you want everybody to know?
Yeah.
That my take was kind of that they can do right now that's actually going to make things better for them, for their family, whatever. And I want to go back to that place of power and freedom and personal responsibility to do what you just asked of people, to let these things simmer for a little bit and just to pause and reflect and not to react, but to really feel into it, lean into it, if you will. That can be very scary.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also a lot of power in doing that. And the more that we practice that and we flex that muscle, the closer we're going to get to really, really being able to optimize this experience for ourselves. As long as we're outsourcing that to somebody else to give us these peak experiences, to give us the knowledge and insight that the gurus of the world and whatnot, what every good guru teaches you is that you have all of this within you. It's just a muscle that you haven't practiced using. So I want to kind of reflect on what you said and give people permission to feel through this, re-listen, think about sad things, cry, take responsibility for all of the power that you have. But you can't tap into that power unless you're able to be authentically vulnerable and authentically yourself. So I'm just adding on to that there's some additional permission from me that if you haven't felt into spaces because you're confronted by what you might find, I suggest opening the door, going down the stairs, whatever it is, and knowing that you're going to be okay. This is we're just all on this ride together.
Thank you for saying that. And maybe also mention where people can find you, your website, your accounts on social media.
Yeah. My podcast is called the Holistic OBGYN Podcast, and it's definitely totally unlike any other women's health podcast, at least one that's curated by an MD that you ever heard. It's much more conversations like this than the sort of like sterile sciencey stuff. You can find that everywhere. It's called the Holistic OBGYN. And then my practice, where people can find me to work with me one-on-one, it's a private association. It's found at belovedholistics.com. Once you join my PCA, which is a $43 annual donation, you can hire me as your doc to be part of your care team. I do occasionally travel for births. It is hard with 2 little girls, and they are definitely my priority. But if it works out, especially if it's locally, I'm absolutely able to do that. But I have a birth coming up in Hawaii and a birth coming up in Miami, both of which are not a quick little drive down the road. So I do that sometimes. I work with people through virtually anything that's going on with your health, men and women, but mostly women, specializing in autoimmune conditions like endometriosis, fertility issues, and then pregnancy and postpartum menopause. I mean, it's really everything. But you can do all of that at my website. And my collaborator program is open to midwives, coaches, doulas, doctors, birth educators, anybody out there who sees some benefit to having an MD that you can consult with regularly. Some states require you to have this, and it's very hard for a lot of midwives in certain states to find MDs because MDs are, just not very friendly, let's just say, to a lot of midwives. So a lot of midwives feel very restricted in what they're able to do because they don't have a collaborative physician, or if they do find one, they're charging them an arm and a leg to work with them, which in and of itself is sort of like a passive-aggressive way of putting them out of business. So I offer that to anybody in any state. I'm licensed in about 12 states at this point, and I don't plan on stopping. This is really my answer to the system, is let's let the system do what it does. In my time with my resources, I'm going to be upholding the traditional midwifery care model. And anybody who's interested can reach out or can sign up at my website.
Amazing. And where can people find you on Instagram?
Oh yeah, it's Nathan Riley, Riley, OBGYN. Nathan Riley, OBGYN is my handle on Instagram and TikTok.
Amazing. I will be sharing everything in the show notes as well, so people can find you there, as well as your podcast. Nathan, thank you again so much for taking the time to share your knowledge and wisdom and for having this conversation with me.
My pleasure, Iris. I just love what you've put together with your show. I am looking forward to hearing more in the future from you and perhaps even collaborating with you in other ways. So thanks you again. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be invited onto shows like this.
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, with your friends, with your family, post about it on social media, or leave a rating or a review on all the platforms. To catch all the latest news from me, you can follow at the Planting Seeds Podcast on Instagram or at Cycle Seeds on Instagram, or you can go to my website, www.cycleseeds.com. Thank you again so much, and I'll see you next time.